Africa's 54 countries present a vast opportunity, but also a complex regulatory puzzle for businesses and investors alike. Today, we are unpacking how this regulatory fragmentation impacts cross-border expansion and hurts investment prospects across the continent. Joining us to break it all down is Dr. Austin Okpagu, Country Manager at Verto. In your opinion, and from your experience as well, why do you think that regulatory fragmentation is such a huge barrier to Africa's economic development and investment potential?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. I mean, there could be several reasons, right? From let me give you a contest.
Yeah, perfect.
Have you ever have you ever tried to visit another African country
Yeah, yes,
and you need visa?
yeah,
Let's say South Africa, and you have to wait for weeks, in some cases, to get approved to visit. And why? Because even more so because this is also within the same continent, but you need some sort of harmonization in terms of or integration within the continent. Government in Nigeria, government in South Africa, in or even in other African countries, to be able to get that authorization for you to even visit another country. More so if you need to do business. So you have to, in fact, business is supposed to be spontaneous, right? But just imagine you have a deal to do in another country, another African country, and you have to wait for weeks to get visa. The business person would have moved on, right? And it would probably be much more easier for that business partner, your prospective business partner, to do business with the world than even within Africa. And that's one of the biggest challenge, right? So aside from the fact that there need to be harmonization in terms of even ID verification, for example, right? If you need to move from Nigeria to Ghana, for example, there's no way that the Ghanaian authority would be able to snap and say, you know what, we know who this person is, because what they require to verify you is different from what the Nigerian business environment or regulatory environment or landscape require, right? So I think those are some of the issues from the government's perspective, but there are much more other issues. You can think about infrastructural issues. So yeah, you can think about regulatory issues in terms of lack of harmonization of identity, which one of the biggest problems, and also in terms of inconsistency in policies within the continent as well, forming some of the barriers, the biggest barriers to businesses. And I'm sure you heard recently about passporting.
yeah.
I think licensed passporting, right? And which is one of the things that proponent of that initiative is aiming to achieve, so that when you have a license in Nigeria, for example, you should be able to do business in another African country. It means the regulators in those countries already recognize that you do have the permission to do business in your home country. As such, you do not need to start from the ground up to be able to assess their market. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So are there examples within Africa or maybe even outside Africa that just shows how harmonized regulations can drive investment and innovation? And what do you think we can learn from these countries or from these regions?
Yeah, absolutely. So you look at what is happening in terms of AFTA, right? You look at what is happening with PAPS, and those are some of from the regional or government perspective, that's what is happening. Again, you also read recently that the Kenyan government have just allowed visa entry
Yeah.
free for Africans, right? What that means, you can literally fly, to Nairobi without having to, even though you have to obviously apply for these things online, but even visa on arrival are some of the things that could ideally solve these problems. And I think that's happening across some markets, some countries in Africa. And the aim really is to liberalize trade in the real sense. It means that, and I think that's the right step in the right direction, until, even if you have an ECOWAS passport in the true sense of it, which most Nigerians do have, it doesn't really give you free access to move within, the region. And so, but we are beginning to see fragmented effort from different countries within the continent that I think is the right step in the right direction. Aside from Kenya, you also look at their countries like maybe like Uganda, Tanzania, for example, is also doing something in that direction. Even though I understand that there's some little, some bit of restriction right now in Tanzania, where some specific sectors, foreigners are not even allowed to do business in those sort of sectors, right? Again, which I think, in my personal opinion, is a setback in terms of what we intend to, what we actually expect to see within the continent, where aside from the freedom of movement, but there should be some, some leverage in terms of foreigners or Africans to be able to go to one country within the continent to set up businesses without being impeded by some regulatory red tapes that is the norm today.
So a key challenge when discussing harmonization of regulations is national sovereignty. So every country wants to be able to do what they want to do without having others dictate how they get to do that. Like you've mentioned, in Tanzania, they want to keep certain sectors within or under the purview of like locals. And I mean, there are often some fairly good reasons for this. But how do you think that countries can balance national interest on one hand or sovereignty on one hand, and then the need to ensure that their sectors are open for business and that the country itself is not inadvertently hampering development in that country?
Look, that's a very vital question. I think that's one of the biggest barrier that most African leaders, right, are contending with. How do you ensure that, you open up your country to other African, citizens, to come in and do business without, it affecting your sovereignty, right, as a country? And we can see some very good examples. Today, I think it has to do with more so about the implementation of that policy, right? Okay. And I think that's why a lot of leaders within the continent are spending decades thinking about it. Have you ever wondered why the one currency in Africa hasn't taken off, right? It's the same fear. But if this works in Europe, why couldn't it work in Africa? And I think that's the puzzle, and there's a question that we need to ask. It's not like we're asking for things that haven't been done in other countries or in other continents. It works. It's the suspicion within the African leaders that has created this. This should have taken off. But I hear that, I think maybe in 2030 or 2029, I'm not sure of the exact date, where EU were saying we would think about having common currency, right? And this is to take care of this kind of concern. But I think it's in terms of balancing. If you look at Africa, it's a block. You have the EU and then you have the ECOWAS. I think if you look at what has happened in between Niger Republic, I think is it Mali, or 3 African countries, they've had to form their own block as well, right? And what was the aim? The aim was for them to make sure that they integrate within themselves and do business within themselves, not even from ECOWAS, right? Because they've had to exit their countries from ECOWAS. But I think it's just around the way the policy is being formulated, right? Which is the first step. The first step is having an ECOWAS passport, which already exists. Ensuring that the database, right, across those countries or member countries is harmonized. And that has to do with integrations, such that all you need, for example, you have an NIN, and NIN does not probably exist. It's not probably called NIN in Ghana or in South Africa. But it should be done in such a way that the moment you impute NIN or BVN, right, it can automatically sync or bring in details, right, about that individual or about that business, right? And that's such that when you do anything that could affect, the country that you intend to do business, it's easy to flag. If you look at what has happened recently about the tax bill that have just been, signed off, what was the aim? Is to harmonize, right? All the taxes. It's the same approach. And so if you use the same model, it takes a bit of time. There will be confrontation. There will be agitations. Why not to do? Why you should do it or why you shouldn't do it. But the reality is that it just has to do with harmonization, such that everyone still retain their authorities, and you retain the authority to deport when you have to, retain the authority to kind of also generate the right revenue that you should generate. And if there's a need for even revenue to be shared among the cooperating country, right? That is also possible. So, but to answer your question simply, it has to do with the way the framework is being designed, right? And I think that we're thinking of building the whole stuff at once. But I think that the approach would be that these countries should be building layer by layer. Today is Kenya saying, you know what, you can come to Kenya and do business without needing a passport. That's one step. And I think that the next step ideally would be that, okay, how do you move from that to ensuring that people can set up businesses in Kenya or in any other African countries from their home country without having to own a physical business, address, a business office in that country, but there's a way it can be tracked. I'm sure you know merchant of record it's already ongoing.
Yeah.
There are startups doing merchant of record MOR. And what is the end game? This is basically what it is. Why is an MOR even in existence in the first place? Is because of the failure, right, within the continent or within countries to be able to establish a framework that allow, corporations between businesses in both countries or within the continent to do business. And that's what you see. That's the offshoot of what you're seeing today.
Okay. So just before I let you go, what role do you think that the private sector should be playing in all of this?
Yeah, the private sector is I think it has to do with organization. Today, it's too fragmented. The private sector needs to play a role. It's not just the government that needs to play a role here. The private sector have to come together in the first instance and also invest in infrastructure. It shouldn't be left alone to the government. Politics and all sort of things affect the rate at which infrastructure can be built. We've seen successes in where PPP have helped fast track development or infrastructural development that we've seen. This happens in Europe, for example, even in the UK and the US, where there's a seamless relationship between the government and the private sector. If you look at the likes of NASIMA, for example, or Lagos Chambers of Commerce, for instance, these are umbrella bodies of businesses, right? It's to say, look, we have been in existence. We know what the pain points are. Can we collaborate with our counterparts in other countries, right, within the continent to say, look, NASIMA or LCCI partners with maybe Ghanaian or Kenyan chambers of commerce that we houses all the businesses and say, you know what, this is our pain point. We want to invest in rail that will connect, working with the government that will connect both countries, or we want to invest in infrastructure, or identity platform that will make for ease of doing business, right? Because we know the pain point, right? So I think that the private sector shouldn't just be onlookers and sit back and just wait for government to do these things. They need to come together and have that conversation, right? And lay the pain points on the table to say, look, these and these and these and these are the core issues that we have. Beyond just having workshops and doing all sort of things, but also taking concrete steps, in ensuring that they are partners in progress with the government to ensure that the things that they want to see gets implemented. And I think that's one of the best ways to look at it. You're beginning to see more business people in government, right? If you look at the kind of things that they're doing in terms of what kind of policies they are pushing forward, it's different from having just 100% politicians who have not really done business, right? Taking ownership of those key sectors. And I think that's basically the very first step. We'll begin to see folks in the private sectors also get into politics, right? And also trying as much as possible to influence those policies that actually favors the business community in a legitimate and transparent way.